Good morning to Dr. T and my fellow friends. Today, our group will be presenting on factors in influencing GDP growth in Malaysia. Our table of content consists of introduction, data and methodology, findings, and also conclusions. Our group member consists of Hanisid Liana Sakira binti Omar, matrix number A162850, Devendran Gunasegaran, matrix number A166669, me, Ahmad Imran bin Muhammad Rizwan, matrix number A163444, Nur Izzati Kamila binti Muhammad Kamil, matrix number A163098, and also Siti Nur Ashikin binti Nur Hisham, matrix number A163232. Next up, we'll be looking on introduction, which will first look at the background regarding Malaysia's GDP. So, since its formation in 1963, Malaysia's economic performance has been one of the Asia's best. Real domestic growth products, which is GDP, grew by an average of 6.5 per year from 1957 to 2005. And Malaysia's GDP once peaked in early 1980s through to mid-1990s as the economy experienced sustained rapid growth, averaging almost 8% of GDP growth annually. And Malaysia, which is once heavily dependent on primary products, which is like rubber and tin ore, now Malaysia is an upper middle income country with multiple sectors of economy based on services and also manufacturing. This is true due to Malaysia now currently is one of the world's largest exporters of semiconductor components, electrical goods, solar panel, and information and communication technology or ICT products. Now, we'll be looking on the crisis faced by Malaysia regarding GDP growth. In 1998, Malaysia faced a severe negative growth rate due to the Asian financial crisis, with a negative rate of negative 7.35 in 1998. However, Malaysia was among the fastest recovering countries in Asia, with a growth rate of 6.1 in 1999. The second crisis faced by Malaysia is in 2009, in which the world economy faced the toughest financial crisis, which broke out from the United States due to the subprime crisis. However, despite a severe case of negative GDP growth, Malaysia proved yet again in its ability to handle such difficult circumstances with a growth rate of 7% GDP in 2010. This is how Malaysia's GDP is currently at. As we can look at, in 1998, Malaysia's GDP was in negative 7.5 due to this Asian financial crisis, and also it was negative 1.5 in 2009 due to the US subprime crisis. Next up, we will be looking on our objectives, in which our research is to examine the factors which influence the growth rate of GDP in Malaysia. We also want to identify the conditions of Malaysia's GDP due to COVID-19, which have been affecting Malaysia's GDP by comparing the previous 30 years since 1990 until 2020, based on the data that we have collected. We also have collected data regarding GDP by referring websites to know the current situation, the current economic situation that Malaysia is currently in by referring to websites like World Banks. So that's all for me. Next up, I'll be passing on data and methodology to my friend Hanis Liana Sakira. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Izzati. Next is data and methodology. This study includes 5 variables: GDP growth, export, import, FDI, and inflation rate. GDP growth will be the dependent variable, while the others will be independent variables. The data used is from the World Bank indicator, and we took 30 samples of data for each variable from 1990 to 2019 in Malaysia. And the methodology used in this project consists of a few steps, beginning with frequency determination, correlation, regression, and graph. We use SPSS software to generate all the data.
Hi, I'm Hanis. I'm going to continue discussing the variable that was used in this project. There are 4 variables that was used, such as foreign direct investment, FDI, inflation, export, and also import. The first variable are inflation. What is inflation? Inflation is the decline of purchasing power of a given currency over time. Inflation, also known as a general or sustainable rise in price, and a higher inflation rate is usually caused by a strong economic growth. According to Robert J. Barrow, inflation is an endogenous variable which may or may not respond to economic growth or other related variable to growth. But the ingenuity of inflation could produce a positive relationship between inflation and growth. According to Galtekin, the rate of return can also affect the relationship between inflation and GDP growth, meaning that if the rate of return is decreasing, then economic growth will have a negative relation with inflation. Moving on to the next variable, which is foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment are an investment made by a firm or individual in one country into businesses' interests located in another country. It is not only to generate money, but also skills, technology, and new knowledge. In a case study, they found out that foreign direct investment does have a positive impact on economic growth in Malaysia. However, all foreign direct investment is subject to the government policies, and this means that there are some unfavorable policies that may slow the FDI progress to Malaysia. For example, the high tariff rates that were set by the government would hinder the foreign direct investment inflows. The third variable are export. Export are goods and services that are produced in one country and sold to buyers in another. According to Hashim, 2014, the relationship between exports and economic growth has been attributed to the potential externalities derived from the exposure of foreign markets. Export can be viewed as an engine of growth in 3 ways. First, export expansion can be a catalyst for output growth directly as a component of aggregate output. Second, growth in exports can affect economic growth indirectly through various routes. And lastly, expanded exports can provide a foreign exchange that allows for increasing level of imports. The last variable is import. Import are goods or services brought in one country that was produced in another. Import has a paramount important role in spurring the growth of the economy, especially in the short run. In Malaysia, economic growth is significantly influenced by import, as well as import is significantly influenced by economic growth. That's all from me. Now I'll pass the presentation to the next presenter.
Next, I will talk about the findings. First is statistic. The mean is the average of the data. So as we can see from the table, out of the 30 data that we have retrieved, this is the average for every variables. Next, standard deviation measure how data is spread out from the mean. The lower the number indicates that the data is closer to the mean. So in this table, we can see that almost all of the variables have a low standard deviation. Next is correlation. A correlation between variables indicates that as one variable changes in value, the other variables tends to change in a specific direction. According to the table, there are 3 significant correlations between the variable. First, with the correlation of 0.658, foreign direct investment has a significant correlation with GDP. Second, with a correlation of 0.555, Inflation has a significant correlation with FDI. And the last one, with correlation of 0.873, import has a significant correlation with export. Next, I'll pass the presentation to Devendran.
Alright, I'm Devendran here. So today I'm gonna continue my presentation on regulation. So firstly, we will see the table that related to the variable enter and remove. So basically for this study, our group choose 4 independent variable, which will be inflation, export, FDI, and import. For the dependent variable will be GDP growth. Second table over here represent model summary. Model summary shows us how the independent variable influence the rate of GDP growth as a group. R as a maximum value of 1. The value of R in this study is 0.773. This indicates to us that the 4 independent variable does not accurately predict GDP growth. And with the R square of 0.597, it says that export and import of goods and service, foreign direct investment, and consumer price inflation can predict 59.7% of the variance in GDP growth in Malaysia from year 1990 to 2019. The adjusted R square defines the number of analysis and predictor variable. The R square is tested in the ANOVA table to see if it is significantly greater than 0. The p-value in the column 6 is 0.001. The p-value must be less than 0.05 to indicate that the test and regression are significant. As a result, because the p-value is 0.001, the value of R square is more than 0, and the independent variable can have a considerable impact on Malaysia GDP growth. This coefficient table displays the independent variable that are statistically significant to the outcome at the individual level. The beta for export of goods and services is negative 0.114 in the unstandardized coefficient column, meaning that if export of goods and services change by 1%, GDP growth will fall by 0.114%. And the beta for import is 0.152. This suggests that a 1% increase in consumer price inflation will result in 0.152% increase in GDP growth. For the foreign direct investment, the beta is 1.330. A 1% increase in consumer price inflation will result in a 1.330% increase in GDP growth. Finally, for the inflation beta is negative 1.072. This suggests us that a 1% increase in consumer price inflation, it will reduce the GDP growth by 1.072%. The t-test under coefficient table reflect the value used to evaluate whether to accept or reject a hypothesis using the bell curve. Since the coefficient table already has a p-value, therefore the bell curve test is unnecessary. The p-value of each independent variable is represented by the last column. Because the p-value of export and import was 0.095, they had no effect on GDP growth. With a value of 0.001, we can conclude that foreign direct investment has a considerable impact on GDP growth. Inflation has a p-value of 0.018 and is significant for the dependent variable. Next, we are moving to the final part of finding, which is known as graph. So firstly, we will see the graph for export. This scatter line of best fit has a R square of 0.045, indicating that export of goods and services are accounted for 4.5% of the variance in GDP growth. This demonstrates that exports are inversely connected to GDP. This seems to be like for every % increase in export, there will be a proportional drop in GDP growth. The second graph represents the graph for import. The line of best fit of R square value is 0.008. This indicates that the import of goods and services accounted for 0.8% of the variance in GDP growth. This demonstrates the import are related to GDP in a favorable way. However, at a certain rate, it will have a negative impact on GDP growth. This graph represents for foreign direct investment. The R square value of this line of best fit is 0.432. This indicates that the FDI is accounted for 43.2% in the GDP growth. It also indicates that FDI growth is linked to GDP growth. This means like every % increase in FDI will result in the corresponding increase in GDP as well. This last graph represents for inflation. Therefore, the line of best fit has a R square value of 0.007. This indicates that the consumer price inflation is accounted for 0.7%. This demonstrates that inflation is positively related to GDP. This is because as the inflation rate rises, GDP rises marginally as well.
Hi, let's continue with a conclusion. My name is Siti and I will conclude our project. Hi, let's continue with a conclusion. My name is Siti and I will conclude our project. Hi, let's continue with. As my friend states before, there were 4 variables that influence GDP. That is import, export, FDI, foreign direct investment, and inflation. From our analysis, all of the variables are interrelated. We also find out that these variables are the factors that influence the GDP growth rate of Malaysia. First, the import. GDP will likely increase due to import tax. When we increase the import in our country, import also shows the positive correlation with GDP when Malaysia decide to buy goods or services from other country. The second are the export. Export is where Malaysia sell goods or services. This shows that the negative correlation with GDP. Next is FDI, foreign direct investment. FDI shows significant correlation with GDP. This is probably due to the fact that we managed to bring in investment from foreign companies that will bring in job opportunities. Last one is inflation. Inflation also shows significant correlation with GDP. This is probably because people will spend more money since they know that it will be less valuable in future. Because of this, we can conclude that all variables except export has significant impact on GDP. Before we end, our group decided to give a recommendation to increase our country's GDP. The recommendations are increasing minimum wage. By increasing minimum wage, it will lead people to spend more and buy imported items. This shows the factor of import and inflation that correlate with each other. Due to this, also government by Bank Negara can also make changes in monetary change by reducing in interest rate, resulting increase in spending by citizens of Malaysia and could also lead to higher investment of FDI. Here is the end of our group project. Thank you for listening.